Good morning. That beautiful music and Garrett's meditation open us to the joy, which is the theme of this third Advent Sunday. And I certainly feel it. And it's a joy to be back from New York. And it was a joy to send you that little video from New York when we came across that big, whatever you call that, flashing lights in Times Square. So it's the Christmas season. What a beautiful time of year. A time when we express our love and appreciation for one another, for those we hold dear. And one way we do that is that we tend to shower our family, friends, and loved ones with gifts. And in order to figure out what that is, we have to ask them, what do you want for Christmas? So this gift giving is one of the ways in which we celebrate the spirit of Christmas. But what is the spirit of Christmas? What is the spiritual meaning of Christmas? And in this process of celebrating Christmas, this asking, what would you like for Christmas? And then people ask us, what do you want for Christmas? And so then we engage, we go shopping, we find these gifts. Sometimes we dash into a store on the way home from work, or we sit there on the computer, surfing the internet, hoping, with the family members sitting in the same room, but making sure they don't see the screen so that we can hide this beautiful little kind of surprise we're creating for them. And this is all part of the joy and festivity of the season. So we give plenty of attention to what others want and what we want for Christmas. But do we ever ask the question, what does Jesus want for Christmas? After all, it's his birthday we're celebrating, right? So normally when it's someone's birthday, you say, well, what do you want for your birthday? What would Jesus like for his birthday? And now, of course, this could sound a little bit like, what would Jesus do? Remember that phrase that kind of went viral some years back? But setting that aside, what are we celebrating in Christmas? Are we celebrating the fact of this birth of Jesus 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem? Yes, we are, in part. But is this primarily what Jesus wants from us? Does he want us to celebrate his birth over 2,000 years ago? Is this the good news? Not quite. Jesus wants something far more significant, far more directly relevant to our lives and to his mission. Jesus wants something from us and for us with each and every Christmas. And what that is Jesus wants the birth of Christ in us. He's not so interested in the infant Savior or in the crucified Christ. Those are all important parts of that drama 2,000 years ago. And they're the important parts of the advent of this whole awakening of Christ consciousness. But what Jesus wants is for us to give birth to that Christ consciousness through our own hearts, through our own beings, here and now. And when I use the word Christ or Christ consciousness today, we could also substitute Krishna consciousness, or Buddha nature, or Fitra in Islam, or Yahweh in Judaism, any number of the names for this infinite supreme being or supreme presence that is to be awakened and birthed through us. As Charles Fillmore said, Christ is but another name for that everlasting principle. It is that masculine and feminine principle which exists in all things everywhere. It exists today. It is alive today as expressed in and through humanity. We don't look back 2,000 years. We look into the omnipresent now for this life-giving one, with a capital O, the one. And what Jesus wants is for us to become that one. And this is the good news. As Angelus Silesius declared, Christ could be born 1,000 times in Galilee, but all in vain until Christ is born in me. Now, how does this birth of Christ through us, how does this take place? I can't resist a little interjection here. The famous human rights activist Sojourner Truth. Many of you probably know of her. She was an American slave. She gave birth to 13 children, most of whom were sold into slavery. And in her agony about that, she said no one heard her except Jesus. But at one point, she was giving a speech in 1851 on women's rights. And there was a preacher in the church who had told her that, men have more rights than women. And so here's what she said. That little man in black there says that women cannot have as many rights as men. Why? Because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, let me ask, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a man. I blew it. From God and a woman. The patriarchy slipped through there for a minute. Where did your Christ come from? She said, from God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with it. So that's one answer. Jesus gives us another answer in different ways, of course, throughout the Gospels. But one of the most intimate is in his conversation with Nicodemus. When Nicodemus comes to them in the dark of night so that he will escape attention and basically says to him, Rabbi, we know you are a teacher come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs you are doing if God were not with him. Jesus replied, truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again. How can a person be born again? Nicodemus asked. Surely we cannot enter a second time into our mother's womb. Jesus answered, truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless he is born of water and spirit. What is born of flesh is flesh. What is born of spirit is spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying you must be born again. The wind blows where it will. You hear the sound of it, but you know not whence it comes or whither it goes. So it is with all those born of the Spirit. So what does this mean, to be born of water and spirit? We get perhaps a clear hint from a passage in Ezekiel where the Lord describes the divine renewal of Israel. And here's what God says. I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit into you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and keep my laws. So to be born of water and spirit is first to be completely cleansed and then to be infused with the very Spirit of God directly in the heart. Let us consider water for a moment. Water purifies and cleanses. Water dissolves the false self. Water also reflects the divinity. Still waters run deep, and perfectly still water reflects the heavens and the stars perfectly. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, if you will. The tears of the heart are the cleansing waters from the beloved, which cleanse and wash and empty the heart and prepare the heart to become the sacred vessel, the temenos, for this birth of Christ consciousness. for the living Spirit of God to enter the heart. This is the real meaning of Christmas. And this is the good news, that this can happen at any time, not just on Christmas. So I want to tell you a little story about joy in the heart. There was a noted Baptist preacher, Jess Moody, who met Rose Kennedy, the mother of President John F. Kennedy and the whole, clan of Kennedy politicians. And Moody was teaching a Bible study class, and Rose Kennedy was attending. And one night, Moody said to them, he charged them, he said he wanted them to make their hearts ready to receive the Lord, for you never know what's going to happen in life. And after the class, Rose Kennedy went up to him and spoke to him privately, and she said, I have done what you're talking about. And she explained that as a young bride, she had become totally enamored of money and glamour. And she became very selfish and covetous in her life. And then she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. And this sort of revolutionized her heart and opened her to love. However, it soon became apparent that this little infant girl was severely mentally retarded. And this absolutely devastated Rose Kennedy and her husband Joe. And they had to make the very painful decision to institutionalize their daughter. This devastation eventually turned into rage and anger at God. And Rose Kennedy said, how could you have done this to us? And she raged at God and demanded to know, what and why have you done this? Her anger became corrosive bitterness over time, and it drained out all the joy in her life. Anger grew in my heart, Rose said. How could God do such a thing to this innocent child and to me? I turned my back on God and my husband and my closest friends, and I became a recluse. One night during the Christmas season, Rose and her husband were supposed to attend a Christmas function and celebration. And she realized that she couldn't trust herself not to go crazy, not to become consumed and make a scene if anyone asked her about her daughter and how her daughter was doing. And her husband realized, you're right, you might just do that. So they decided not to go. At the last minute, they stayed at home. And then right in that moment, something happened. The maid who worked for the family spoke. And she said, please excuse me, Mrs. Kennedy, but I've been watching over you the past few weeks, and I've seen how angry you are. I understand, but I have to say, if you don't do something, it's going to ruin you. I think you should pray this prayer. Oh Lord, make my heart a manger where the Christ child can be born. At this, Rose Kennedy was infuriated, and she fired her maid right on the spot, sent her out. But that night when she went to bed, she couldn't sleep. She kept tossing and turning. She could not get those words out of her mind. And she said, my mind ruminated relentlessly, keeping me awake. I could not forget that lovely face, the sweetness of the maid, the joy in her spirit, and especially her words. And finally, Rose got up, knelt by her bed, and in an act of deep surrender, she prayed, oh Lord, make my heart a manger where the Christ child can be born. And in that moment, in the dark depths of the night, she cried out in anguish. And God answered her prayer. I've always been religious, she told Jess Moody. And I've always believed in Jesus, but this was different. On that night, Rose opened her heart to Christ in a whole new way. And her heart did in fact become a manger where Christ could be born again. And as she described it, love replaced the anger that had gripped my soul. I felt a fresh, new, divine entry into my life. And there was born in me a love for mentally handicapped children. And that was a transformative moment in her life. And soon thereafter, Rose Kennedy rehired the maid who stayed with the family until she died many years later. And it's possible now, in these days leading up to Christmas, that perhaps some of you are also feeling fear, worry, anger, doubt, or other distress that distracts you or drains the joy from your heart. And if so, don't put up a sign in your heart that says, "No room at the inn for Jesus this Christmas." Open your heart to the love and grace of Christ. Allow the one to enter the depths of your heart and become one with you. And pray this simple prayer: "O Lord, may my heart be a manger where Christ can be born." This is what Jesus wants for us. This is what he really wants for Christmas. As Meister Eckhart asked, "What good is it to me if Mary gave birth to the Son of God 1400 years ago and I do not give birth to the Son of God in my own time and in my own culture?" We are all meant to be mothers of God because God is always needing to be born. That's beautiful, huh? We are all meant to be mothers of God because God is always needing to be born. And the fullness of time is this: when the Son of God is begotten in me. So Jesus wants your heart to become a manger for the birth of Christ in you. Why the heart? Because the heart is the cosmic womb through which it's the cosmic Mary through which Christ is born through each of us. And why a manger? Because this birth can only take place in the depths and the center of our humility. God became human so that we might become God. Christ incarnated in the flesh to show us the way. This is the good news. And when this happens, we are ushered into a new life. As St. Paul said, "I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me." And this new life never stops because the heart gives birth to Christ more than once. The timeless, infinite nature of God takes up residence in us and over time replaces who we were completely. Every day becomes Christmas. Every day, a new birth of Christ. Matthew Fox says that each of us is not only a son or daughter of God, but we are a son of God, S-U-N. We are a radiant, living manifestation of God's light and love here on earth. So we are not simply the offspring of the one, but we are actually living manifestations of it, living manifestations of the one and co-creators with the one. Now, all this sounds very grand and glorious, and it is at one level. But this is something that takes place inwardly, intimately, hidden away from the world, in the interior, inmost depths of our own being. There's a part of our hearts that is reserved only for God. And as Ernest Holmes says, this new birth comes not by observation nor by loud proclamation, but through an inner sense of reality. We cannot tell where this comes from if we look to outward things, as it proceeds from the innermost parts of our own being. So this is a very delicate, intimate matter between the soul and God. And if there's a birth, there must also be some kind of gestation prior to this birth. There's a profound saying from the great Sufi saint Al-Hallaj, who said, "Our hearts are a virgin that God's truth alone opens." This saying had a very deep impact on the famous Trappist monk Thomas Merton. And it speaks to how when the heart is ready, the Spirit or the seed of God pierces the heart. And this creates a kind of pregnancy of the heart, if you will, and a gestation, which eventually leads to a birth through the heart of the Christ. My soul doth magnify the Lord, proclaimed Mary, when this pregnancy happened in her heart, in her womb, but also in her heart. And this is what we are called to. Each of our souls is called to magnify the Lord. Many years ago, it was about 20 years ago, I was in a period of my life, I moved into a period of deep solitude for several years. I didn't think it would last that long, but it was about 7 years. And it was a very intensive period of inner meditation and prayer. And about 2.5, 3 years into this, I became aware of something happening in my heart. Actually, Jack Kornfield, the Buddhist meditation teacher, talks about this also. He talks about when people do serious meditation and prayer, at some points, you can actually feel the heart as it is open. It's almost like God is in there, literally prying open your heart. You can feel a kind of, oftentimes, a pain as it's being opened. And actually, some meditators get concerned that they're having some kind of heart trouble. And, he encourages you to check it out with the doctor, but he explains that this is part of the process. As the kind of covering of the heart is broken open by that intensive aspiration and prayer. And basically, the beloved, or God, gently and with great kind of almost surgical precision opens and gets inside and stretches and opens. And in this period, I became aware, I started to have the feeling, and this is quite personal and it's hard to describe, and I kept it quite private, but I started to have the feeling that there was something happening in my heart. And one day in meditation, it just came to me what it was, which was this phrase came to my mind that I felt pregnant with God. And I hadn't heard of that before, and I thought, well, that sounds pretty. I didn't know. I just knew that's how it felt. And I kept it to myself because it felt very intimate and very private. And it continued for quite some time, and it was quite palpable. I could feel a kind of pressure. I could feel a kind of bursting, an inner bursting within the heart. And it was there all the time around the clock for many months. And one day I was with one of my friends and colleagues, close friend Diane Haug, who is a colleague in the breathwork that we do. And she just looked at me at one point and she said, "I think you're pregnant with God." And I just like, that's my secret. How did she know that? Where did that come from? But she knew. First of all, she knew the process. But I'd never heard that term, but that's what she said. And it was so striking because it was a kind of, not that I needed a validation, but it was kind of an independent kind of witness in a way. And by the way, that period is what led to the birthing of the whole gender equity and reconciliation training program that we're still involved in, which is now a young, strapping 20-something. So this is a very delicate, intimate, and profound process. And God invites us into this. As Charles Fillmore says, the new birth is simply the realization by us of our true spiritual identity, with the fullness of power and glory that follows. The new birth is a change that comes here and now. It has to do with the present person, that we may be conscious of the Son of Man, who is the real I am in each individual person. Deity, he says further, deity is incarnating itself in creation. So to believe in Jesus is to believe in that regenerated state that we are to be, like him, joint heirs with Christ. So this is the call. Christ renews life, and the celebration of Christmas every year, God infuses humanity with a new breath of spiritual life. God breathes new life into humanity every Christmas. So Christmas is not just a repetitive celebration of a magnificent birth 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem. Christmas is a rebirth of Christ every year. And we must make room for that birth of Christ in our own hearts and in our own lives. And this means that we create this receptivity and emptiness within to make our inner heart, to prepare us. This entails a kind of process of purification, of cleansing, of relinquishing the false self, old self-concepts, rigid patterns of thought. For as we know from the third unity principle, as we think, so we become. So we accept this cleansing, transformative process in the depths of our own inner being and prepare the way for spirit, for this birth to take place. We cannot force it. It has a will and nature of its own, but we can open to it. We can invite it. As Angelus Silesius says again, if in your heart you make a manger for his birth, then God will once again become a child on earth. So let us now just gently close your eyes or have a soft gaze to the floor and ask your heart inwardly right now, what is God wanting of me now? What is God giving birth to in me right now in this moment? What does Jesus want to tell me, to show me, to direct me? How is Christ being